Well, thank you to Rawi for taking me and to Mizna for taking me back. Delighted to present on a film that I was proud to program into the 2014 edition of Mizna's Twin Cities Arab Film Festival. The title of the film is Rags and Tatters, written and directed by Ahmed Abdallah. The Arabic title is Farshu Ghata. It's an accurate translation in meaning, if not in letter, and I'd be happy to discuss with you more about the double meaning of the title itself. Here are the contents of my presentation. I'm going to try to move at a bit of a clip, so forgive me. I'm going to first characterize the film, then make some distinctions between some concepts that may have been brought up in describing the film, stamping my own, a concept that I've derived that I call sacrificial nihilism. I'll then explain why I think Rags and Tatters is a film of sacrificial nihilism, or a work of sacrificial nihilism, having already grounded my interest in cinema, transitioning into cinema through the work of Pier Paolo Pasolini, and then in investigating the various reasons for its being a sacrificial nihilistic work. I link to works by Ingmar Bergman, as well as by Woody Allen. You're welcome to boo if you'd like. And then I'll try to, if I have enough time, I'll play you a trailer towards the end and then close. Okay, so if I were to ask to characterize Rags and Tatters, I'd probably call it a historiographic film, in the sense that it records what took place during the January 2011 revolution in Egypt. But it moves the heightened locus of the revolution to somewhere other than what most films have done. I would certainly call it an art film. It employs many of the tropes that are customary to art films, such as reflexivity, laconism, precise compositions, long takes, even so-called sequence shots or plan sequence, where the scene is a single shot. I would also describe it as a transgressive film. It undercuts conventions of fiction film that we often see, and it does so through a systematic process of what I call denial or withdrawal. But my argument is that this is most importantly a nihilistic text, or a work of nihilism, and a specific brand of nihilism that I have come up with that I call sacrificial nihilism. So I'd like to ground this in the work of one of the exponents of nihilism, Friedrich Nietzsche, already brought up, who makes a distinction between two strands of nihilism. There's the nihilism that comes to mind, often employed pejoratively, associated with the work of the Unabomber or the shootings in the Aurora cinema. But Nietzsche makes a distinction between the arguably commonly dealt negative impression or conception of nihilism as a passive nihilism that involves a diminishment of the human spirit, versus an active nihilism that involves an increase in the power of the spirit, whereby what has occurred up to the moment no longer feels appropriate, no longer seems functional or viable. I believe that moment was the 2011 revolution in Egypt, and that it impacted Ahmed Abdallah to put forth his text both in writing and in directing. I'd like to ambiguate here nihilism from anarchism, which are often confused. So the rejection of traditional valuation may coincide with the rejection of authority, but revolution is not the goal of nihilism, even in its active form. Rather, the act of rejection in itself is, such as an instance of artistic expression, filmmaking, for example. Whereas anarchism instrumentalizes organization among many to carry out assaults, nihilism implicates the individual. I tried Googling nihilist organizations, for example, and the highest ranking one I came up with was the American Nihilist Underground Society. and it looked pretty poorly kept as well. I'd like to distinguish nihilism from martyrdom. So one martyrs oneself or a member of one's family. We've heard of like so-and-so martyred his son, or somebody from the community of association. But I've never heard a martyrdom of a work. A work of sacrificial nihilism, I would envision in relation to some of the films we'll be exploring, is tantamount to a public immolation of it. Pier Paolo Pasolini. Many directors have been associated with nihilism, from Stanley Kubrick to Miike Takashi, but arguably the director who's most associated with nihilism is Pasolini. And you can see here, relating to his first feature film, Acetone, nihilism becomes a figure of emancipation as it belies the capitalist illusion of ontological fullness, and in doing so inaugurates a new dialectic of subtraction and sublimation involving potentially the radical reconfiguration of our symbolic space. A few years later, for his short on Where Are the Clouds, in a sense, nihilism allows for utopia to shine through. You don't get the utopian vision directly, but what you get is a sort of an opening whereby an alternative concept of the world may emerge. It's sort of akin to a psychotropic drug that kind of restarts the brain, so that what might have seemed like impediments, societal impediments, are no longer seem necessarily negotiable. Anybody seen Salo or 120 Days of Sodom? Based on the novel by the Marquis de Sade, probably the most, it's the last of Pasolini's films, and arguably his most nihilistic work. It centers on 4 libertine fascists during World War II who kidnap 9 teens and subject them to unspeakable physical, mental, and sexual torture. The film is almost it's not only agitating in its graphic imagery, but also because it depicts no defiance at all, with the exception of a single act, whereby the pianist who'd been employed to play throughout this sort of entrapment period, at one point just gets off her piano, walks up the stairs, and pushes herself off of a window to her own demise. Suicide will figure into all 4 films that I'll be looking at. Now, for time. Why is Rags and Tatters nihilistic? I would argue that it is for 3 sort of categories of reasons. A denial of location, a certain location, voice, and information, the intro, and the closing. So I think there's a good idea, a good time to look at sort of the quick plot line of the film. On the 28th of January 2011, escapes took place from 5 prisons in Egypt. Later in that year, the Ministry of Interior reported that they'd managed to capture a third of the inmates that had escaped, and now it's 20,000 of them, which tells you that 60,000 escaped. There were also reported shootings by guards who then abandoned their posts. So the protagonist escapes from one of these prisons, or leaves it, and then takes a public microbus to a district called Sayda Zainab, which was established during the time of the Mamalik, or the Mamluks, about at least half a century ago. Once a prestigious sort of posh, opulent area, it's sort of diminished into disrepair. And then on foot he goes to an area called Imam Shafi'i, also called City of the Dead, or the Cairo. I've seen the Cairo necropolis. I don't particularly appreciate that because it focuses on the dead, not the living, who populate this mass mausoleum established at the time of the Islamic conquest. And then from there takes a private truck to Manshiat Nasr, also called pejoratively Garbage City, which is populated mostly by Copts who emigrated there in the early 70s and work in recycling. So if you see, here's a map of the 5 prisons. I just took, for example, one of the prisons there. Sorry about the iconography. And you see the movement there from the circle to the Golden House. That's where Sayyidah Zainab is, from there on foot to Imam al-Shafi'i, and from there by private truck to Manshiyat Nasr, where the film ends. I want to alert you to the movement here. The trajectory has the protagonist moving away from the river. But there's a shot deliberately chosen by Ahmad Abdullah where the protagonists sit against the river. You'll see it in the trailer on the opposite side of the river, as if to sort of, with two smoke columns emanating, as if to tell the audience, I'm not taking you there. I'm not taking you to Tahrir. Here's a list of just the narrative films that have come out about the Egyptian revolutions. Almost all center either their story or their mythos in Tahrir Square. Okay, so Persona, you're wondering how did I get there? Yes, well let me tell you a couple of things here. The film that reminds me more than any other of Ahmad Abdullah's work is Persona. Persona, Ingmar Bergman's masterpiece from 1966, begins with images of camera equipment and projectors lighting up and projecting dozens of brief cinematic glimpses, including a lot of archetypes: crucifixion, an erect penis, a tarantula, and most lingeringly a boy. The images are presented discordantly, including with a celluloid strip that catches on fire. The opening sequence avant-gardist pretensions are evident. Persona then switches to its principal narrative part in a hospital wherein Elizabeth, played by Liv Ullmann, is being hospitalized for having turned mute. A renowned actress, Elizabeth has lost the power of speech while performing on stage. In her hospital room, she reacts distraughtly to footage on its TV of Thich Quang Duc, images of self-immolation by the Buddhist monk on a busy Saigon intersection in 1963 in protest of the South Vietnamese government's treatment of Buddhists. The world did not, however, see the self-immolation images of Mohammed al-Bouazizi, a Tunisian street vendor who torched himself at a street intersection outside the governor's office in the town of Sidi Bouzid on the 17th of December 2010, so about a month before the events that start Rags and Tatters take place, in protest of confiscation of his wares and continual harassment and humiliation that he reported was inflicted on him by municipal and police officers. The prison escape that launches Rags and Tatters arguably links to this event in that Bouzid's self-immolation started protests, which then turned into the Tunisian Revolution, toppling Ben Ali regime, and then the revolution in Egypt took place. What else about Rags and Tatters involves denial? Like Persona, Rags and Tatters' opening sequence is discordant. It's 7 minutes of poorly lit, grating imagery, wherein the aspect ratio transforms 5 times. It starts with borrowed footage, ostensibly shot in a prison itself, and then switches to the narrative film. So I'm hoping to show you a few clips here. Besides withdrawal of information, besides this opening sequence that's really discordant and difficult to get through, there's also a denial of voice. The protagonist does not speak in this film. But whereas the protagonist in Persona is, there's a pathological explanation, at least for her turning mute, trauma as it were, here the protagonist is seen to speak. We can tell he speaks, but we are not only denied his voice, but also even denied his lips, as you will see in this sequence. He's telling his comrade here about this recording that took on a phone in prison that a deceased friend had given him. This happens more than once in the film. The director is so arch that he's willing to deny us and the protagonist information being conveyed by a protester who's just come back from Tahrir Square. The closing is also implicated in this, in what I call this denial, in that it takes place during a skirmish whose sectarian nature is indicated by the camera flashing. I'm not going to show you the closing. I've already spoiled the film for you. By the camera flashing across, tattooed on a participant, one of the participant's shoulder, concluding. The film concludes with not only the protagonist being shot, but also the camera person being felled by a bullet, leaving the camera, the instrument of recording, idle on the ground, capturing the Cairo sky instead of the pregnant skirmishes that are taking place in the vicinity. Okay, Bergman was a world-renowned artist by the time Persona was released in '66 and was working with the Swedish film studio Svensk Film Industry. Despite its transgression and experimentalism, Persona was not out of character for Bergman, nor did it entail any risk to his career, one that was helped by his films consistently coming under budget, which also happens to be the case with Woody Allen and with Ahmed Abdullah. No film to me reminds me of Rags and Tatters from an industrial standpoint than Woody Allen's film Interiors. Yes. Anybody seen Interiors? Yes. Wow, that's surprising because hardly anybody has. It flopped like a pancake when it came out, even though it was sandwiched between arguably two of his greatest successes, Annie Hall and Manhattan. From an industrial standpoint, the film that comes to mind, as I mentioned, is Interiors. Allen had directed all of his films up to that point, including Interiors, his seventh film, at United Artists under its chair, Arthur Krim. Arthur Krim shared a special collaboration with Woody Allen, whereby Allen delivered his films always on time and always under budget. It was Krim, the former advisor to Lyndon Johnson and once political operative, who turned movie mogul, who green-lighted Interiors, and it was Krim who Allen followed when he moved to chair Orion Pictures, leaving his job at United Artists. And here's what the statement that I'm going to sort of link to Ahmed Abdullah from. Woody Allen's Interiors may be one of the rare instances in modern American movie history in which if an artist has been allowed to make a picture, a commercial picture, because it might mean creative development for him. There is a difference, of course, between the two films. Interiors, which is Woody Allen's homage to his favorite director, Ingmar Bergman again, and between Rags and Tatters. Whereas Interiors was made with personal artistic development in mind, Rags and Tatters did the same while grounding its maker's concerns in those of Egyptian societies. The poor of Sayyida Zainab, the assailed folk singers and performers of Mulids, and the water-deprived living amidst the tombs in Imam al-Shafi'i, and the illegally settled Copts of Manshiat Nasr who recycle waste at the steps of their homes. But there is sort of a curious similarity between, in the relationships between Krim and Woody Allen, and between producer Mohammed Hafzi and Ahmed Abdullah. Hafzi established a film clinic in 2005. He's produced about 20 films and written a script for quite a few of them. And he has produced every single one of Ahmed Abdullah's films since his second microphone, including his upcoming Zombie Goes to Zombie, reportedly the Middle East's first zombie comedy. Now, I've had it up to here with zombie films, but from Ahmed Abdullah, I'll take almost anything. I think I'd like to conclude. To some, Utopia may be conceptually elusive and actually unattainable, but that hasn't stopped humans from imagining it, from Eden to the Republic. Rags and Tatters defies expectations of a narrative film to a degree that sabotages its chances of exposure and market success, even within art house cinema. It is constructed as a contrapuntal to the drone of the staid and the safe, an obstinate, explosive vehicle designed to puncture, if not to penetrate, the occlusive, indeterminate walls erected by commerce and buttressed by convention. A vehicle so well designed as to alert us that at times it is sensible for an artist to sacrifice a brainchild in the hope that future creative works may be delivered into a world that's better, whose cinema is better. Thank you very much.